Rasmussen. I'm chief of the Global Issues and General Division at the Office of the Historian, where I work on foreign relations in the United States. And I'm very, very pleased to be here today, both in Austin at the Clements Center in general, as well as the chair of this panel in particular. Before I start my remarks, let me echo the thanks that have already been given to the organizers of this conference, Jennifer and Jacqueline and Kathy and Jeff and Mark and Will. You're putting on a really just a great sort of very thoughtful day. It's well executed, and it's just giving us a lot of food for thought. So thank you very much. As I say, I'm delighted to be chair of this panel, which of course is on Détente and the Periphery. And we have today we have four scholars, and I'm going to give very short introductions to them in the order in which they're going to speak. Our first speaker will be Stephen Randolph. Steve Randolph joined, before he joined the Office of the Historian in 2011, he had a varied career that involved being an Air Force pilot to being a graduate student at the George Washington University, if memory serves, and also serving for a number of years at the National Defense University. He joined our office in 2011 as the general editor of the Foreign Relations series. He was Adam's predecessor in that role, and then became the historian in 2012. Okay. Steve is an expert on the Vietnam War. In 2007, Harvard University published his book, Powerful and Brutal Weapons, Nixon, Kissinger, and the Easter Offensive. Next up, we'll have another of my colleagues at the Office of the Historian, Myra Burton. Myra is the chief of the Africa and Americas division, where she also works on the Foreign Relations of the United States series. She is the proud editor of 4 FRUS volumes dealing with Africa during the 1970s. So if you want to know about U.S. foreign policy in Africa, Myra is the person to go to, including one of the volumes that she compiled was Southern Africa 1969 to 1976, from which she's drawing in order to do her paper today. And she has currently switched decades, and now she is working on the Reagan administration's approach to Southern Africa over 2 volumes. Myra will be followed by Joe Parrott. Joe just got his PhD from Texas in May 2016. Congratulations, very nice. He's currently in the Henry Chauncey Jr. postdoc fellow at Yale, where he is working on the topic upon which he's going to present today, the implications of Portuguese decolonization for U.S. domestic politics. I kind of thought of Wendell Willkie. This notion about there being one world, things have sort of interesting reverberations. Things across the world can have interesting reverberations at home. Finally, we have David Robarge, chief historian at the Central Intelligence Agency since 2005. He's the author of numerous classified and unclassified works on the history of intelligence. Happily, one of his classified works has recently been declassified. It was a biography that he wrote of it's a Washingtonian to me, the Director of Central Intelligence, John McCone, was recently declassified, and David's currently working on securing a commercial publisher for that, which is excellent. I know we will be very excited to get that work. His current project, from also which he will, sort of the basis of what he'll talk about today, he's currently working on a classified history of the President's Daily Brief, the PDB, that will be for internal use only. So with no further ado, let me turn it over to Steve.
Okay, well, let me start by thanking the organizers and offering my disclaimer that the views expressed are my own and not those of the Department of State or the U.S. government. The sources for this talk include the Foreign Relations series, the Clements Papers, and the Nixon tapes, so I'm claiming a triple credit for my research effort here, and it takes a very different approach. It ties in very closely, I think, to the second panel we had this morning in terms of talking about agency, morality, and politics, and I think we'll all see that as a central theme of this talk I'm about to give. But I address it at a different level than the speakers have to this point. I look more at the presidential decision-making and the terrible forces brought to bear on a president at a time of crisis, which is what we'll be talking about. The paper will focus on about a 1-minute stretch of the Nixon tapes, in fact, kind of a fugitive conversation on a busy day for the president from the last weeks of America's war in Vietnam, November 30th, 1972. Brief as it was, I think this conversation requires us to rethink our understanding of the endgame of America's war in Southeast Asia and the sequel. I will cover all this in 5 segments: the context, the conversation, the aftermath, some alternative history just for the fun of it, and the implications. So first of all, the context. The conversation occurred during a period of sustained drama and tension and stress which gripped the White House for months as Nixon and Kissinger sought to bring the Vietnam War for a close. Briefly, to summarize an extremely complex sequence, Kissinger and North Vietnamese Politburo member Le Duc Tho reached a peace settlement in mid-October that was subsequently bitterly rejected by America's ally, President Thieu of South Vietnam, on two bases fundamentally. First, that it left North Vietnamese forces in a leopard spot pattern throughout South Vietnam, and secondly, that it gave the communists a role in South Vietnam's government. Nixon and especially Kissinger found themselves trapped between the two Vietnamese parties, employing coercive diplomacy against both of them, enemy and ally alike. One remarkable aspect of this period, I think unprecedented in American diplomatic history, if you can call this diplomacy, between October and January of 1973 was the intense correspondence between President Nixon and Thieu. Time and again, as the negotiations progressed, or more when they stagnated, Nixon wrote Thieu insisting that the peace agreement was the best that could be negotiated, that while not ideal, the terms assured the survival of Thieu's government, and that it was imperative that the United States and South Vietnam remain visibly united to ensure post-war congressional support for South Vietnam. And it was a central aspect of these letters as well that repeatedly Nixon assured Thieu that in the event of North Vietnamese violation of the peace accords, that America would respond with its full military might, understood by all as a return to the conflict of American air and naval forces, especially the B-52s that have been such a pivotal factor in crushing the North Vietnamese offensive in 1972. The clearest statement of that's from a letter that Nixon wrote, signed out on November 14th. Far more important than what we say in the agreement is what we do in the event the enemy renews its aggression. You have my absolute assurance that if Hanoi fails to abide by the terms of this agreement, it is my intention to take swift and severe retaliatory action. Thieu accepted these written presidential assurances as an integral part of the peace settlement. This has long seemed to me as a remarkable commitment by the president, given that he repeatedly emphasized to President Thieu that it was imperative that they reach a peace agreement before the new Congress got to town in January. If you couldn't get support for an ongoing war, how would you expect to be able to gain support for recommitting American forces? And the solution that I had in my mind, based on no evidence whatever, is that he just had such contempt for the Congress and the left wing of Congress that he thought he could impose his will or perhaps go over their heads to the American people. The answer, it turns out, was simpler in some ways. It emerged on a day that for Nixon was all Vietnam, all day. He had started that morning, November 30th, 1972, talking with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Secretary of Defense, Mel Laird at the time, to give them tasking to plan for air offensives in the case of North Vietnam rejecting the agreement or subsequently violating it. His actual reason for meeting with them, and I will say, was to ensure their support for the peace agreement and kind of shore up his political defenses on the right flank. The conversation took place in a brief interlude between that meeting and a second one that he was about to go into with President Thieu's emissary, Nguyen Phu Duc, who was, broadly speaking, Kissinger's equivalent in South Vietnam, who was going to make the case for changes to the settlement. In the interim, Nixon had a few brief moments with Kissinger. It was triggered by an offhand comment by Kissinger that if you wanted to win the war militarily, quote, you could if you blasted the North Vietnamese for maybe 2 more years. Nixon replied that there's no way we could get the money for it, and then he went on to outline a more immediate concern. We've got a problem here, which I'm sure you're aware of. The commitment that I have made, that in the end this thing breaks out again, we will bomb again, also would require congressional approval. Kissinger was taken aback. Nixon continues, well, then the commitment doesn't mean anything. You get my point. You see here, Henry, here's the point. When we tell them we'll start the war again, in the event the North Vietnamese invade again, Congress is not going to go through with it. Let's just face it. We need to know what we're doing here. I'm simply telling you that we're shooting blanks, so it must be under no illusions. And Nixon concluded, my view is to play it very hard with the North and the South, but we've got to know in our inner councils what the hell we're up against, and what we're up against is getting congressional approval, starting the war again. And it's a really virtuoso display of realpolitik now. Without missing a beat, without even a pause to reflect, Kissinger goes in to consider directly the political military implications. He says, one way to play it hard, Mr. President, would be the first violations. Oddly enough, we bombed a bejesus out of the violator, even though there's an uproar. That's a one-time attack. Because if we overkill the first time, then they're going to be scared. But if we let them do salami tactics, I think it's going to be hard. Nixon saw the promise in that approach. You could get away with that. You could get away with a hell of a bombing strike like that, a quick surgical strike. You couldn't get away, though, with this enormous, well, here we go again, folks. I will say that those of us who use the Nixon tapes come to appreciate the many voices of Richard Nixon, and you have to listen carefully and put all of this into context. Be very, very careful. But this is a conversation which, of the hundreds of hours that I've listened to, is unique. It's a very earnest tutorial tone to Nixon. He imperatively wants to share situation awareness with his primary advisor on this situation. And he's got this urgency about it that's unparalleled, I think. So the aftermath, this is all now the part that's documented in FRUS very well, so I'll kind of run through it quickly. Things happen after that conversation. You have another round of negotiations. Those fail. Then you get the Christmas bombing. Then you get another round of negotiations. And finally, a peace settlement signed on January 27th. That entire time was accompanied by further coercion against President II on the part of President Nixon. I counted the letters, by the way. There were 4 in October, 3 in November, 1 in December, and 3 in January, all making the same points that I made earlier. The ceasefire that was supposed to be triggered by the January 27th agreement obviously famously failed. In fact, the fighting intensified as everybody did land grabs in preparation for the peace that would someday come. But what's less known, I think, is that it failed in almost all aspects. The political components of the agreements never got traction. Most importantly, the North Vietnamese basically executed exactly the same kind of infiltration offensive that they had every dry season since the late 60s, in fact, to replace the forces that had been devastated during their offensive in 72. The only provisions of the settlement that worked as drafted were the American withdrawal from Vietnam, which occurred within 60 days of the ceasefire in 4 increments, and the return of and the kind of a desultory mine-clearing operation that the Navy took on just to keep the North Vietnamese honest. The logistics movement already, within 10 days of the signature of the ceasefire, had Kissinger recommending a strike against the Ho Chi Minh Trail. 10 days. And as he told Nixon, it's March 7th. They're going day and night now, so we could fly during the daytime. We could do a 24-hour thing, and we'd probably raise a lot of hell. I mean, it would basically be a shot across the bow. Nixon refused to accept that advice, and basically the infiltration offensive continues. There's another memo on March the 14th. But by this time, it's important to realize that the strains of the endgame to the American war and the sustained tension over the negotiations and the decisions on military force since October through the Christmas bombing had caused a really severe rift between Nixon and Kissinger. And so it's hard to tell at this point in the war whether they're writing for actual policy purposes or to establish their reputations for toughness or to establish a historical record. And this is actually pretty explicitly stated by Kissinger in his memoirs. So Kissinger, rather oddly, spent this moment to take a vacation, actually, in Acapulco, and in his absence, the high point of this logistics offensive continued. Nixon talked during this period on March 20th, exactly to be precise, with both Al Haig and with Brent Scowcroft, and got their recommendations on what to do. And there you see, I think more clearly than anywhere else, and I urge you to look for this, actually these deep, profound misgivings that Nixon had about recommitting to that war, regardless of Congress, anything. He just didn't want to go back. He says to Haig in the morning, I don't know whether the action at this point, whether the provocation is adequate. He adds a moment later that you just can't get up and do something because of a whim or what appears to be a whim. Later on, he talks to Scowcroft and says, well, by hitting now, we demonstrate that the president is the kind of guy who will use power. Fine. It may demonstrate we'll use it now, but it does not necessarily demonstrate we'll use it later. The circumstances will be substantially changed, and that's something we have to consider. So the real question is whether it's worth doing for its own sake. And Scowcroft acknowledged, in terms of its military effect, I don't think it's worth it. And Kissinger replied, "That's the point. We've been doing this for years." And so once again, he declines to execute the attack. And at this moment, actually now, it's late March, the logistics offensive on the part of the North Vietnamese is about to reach its end because the rainy season is about to get there. This is also precisely the moment when the Watergate complications turn from being kind of a confusing, distant threat to an imminent threat to the survival of the Nixon administration. So the question we can ask in the alternative history is, would this have worked? And the short answer is, I don't see how. The quick surgical strike that Nixon and Kissinger discussed in that conversation was in essence a refined version of the time-limited airstrikes ordered on occasion by the Nixon administration to send a message to the North Vietnamese Politburo. There had been many earlier examples, and they'd all run afoul basically the operational realities of war in Southeast Asia. For one thing, to do any damage, you had to continue long enough to inflict material damage on the North Vietnamese, but by the time you did that, the anti-war movement would be on its feet and screaming at full voice. The political complications were as forbidding as military issues, and in a point that touches exactly on Deputy Secretary Clements, the Nixon administration, second administration was just underway. The players had changed already. The processes that had arisen by late 1972 to govern the war had been almost reinvented with these new people on board. Kissinger was already reaching out to Bill Clements actually to keep the DOD on track in a phone call to Clements comparing the Washington Special Actions Group at the time to a bunch of recalcitrant schoolboys. So what are the implications? There are some historiographical, some from a policy perspective. From a historiographical perspective, I think we look at the kind of received narrative, the historical memory of Watergate as being the force that denied re-entry to the war. I think we can kind of re-examine that at this point. I think this brief conversation creates a prism through which we view this entire period, the negotiations, the Christmas bombing, the construction of a command and control structure in Southeast Asia afterward. Finally, from a policy perspective, you get a view of this intersection of overpowering interests that are all mutually conflicting and which meet at the presidency. You get the political, you get the bureaucratic, you get the strategic, you get the personal, and it's all more than Nixon can handle, I think. He just can't summon the energy to pull the trigger. The other thing I will say from a policy perspective, in line with what we're trying to teach at this school, is that none of these advisors seem to have thought through the follow-on actions on the part of the North Vietnamese. You don't have, if you're Nixon, escalation dominance. You don't have escalatory control. And I think a big part of his uneasiness was, okay, we bomb them, what next? What if they respond with some horizontal escalation? So as you can see, this is a rich and I think complicated part of the war. And I think this particular conversation and sequence help us kind of rethink the complexity of the forces facing Nixon at that period of time. So thank you.
Minutes and 13 seconds. Yes. Well done, Dr. Randolph. Next we turn to Myra Burton.
I would also like to thank everyone associated with this conference. This has been absolutely amazing, and I'm delighted to be a part of it. I just wanted to add. I'm sorry? Oh, I'm live. I wanted to share with you this mid-July email that Joe and I received expressing a little bit of concern that both of us were doing papers on Angola. And they wanted to make sure that you got some semblance of a very fulsome account of the activities of this time period. And so in the spirit of Détente, Joe and I worked out what I think is an elegant solution. I hope you all agree. But I really think the two Angola papers on the same panel mean that we have indeed moved from the periphery to the center. And the other reason I want to thank you all for inviting me to participate, I completed this volume in 2005. It was published in 2011. I looked at it for maybe a day or two. I gave out a lot to friends and family, and then I put it back on the shelf. And so getting involved in this conference has made me look at this anew. And what I saw actually stunned me. I'd forgotten how good these 40 committee meeting minutes are. And I'm not saying that because I compiled the volume. It's true. It's like learning how they make the sausage. It's an ugly process in many ways. Sometimes you just want to avert your eyes, but it's actually quite fascinating in seeing how the administration just grinds towards involvement in a region that many people are wondering, why on earth are we even there? So thank you very much for making me take a look at this. And just as an aside, we just published this morning the Carter Administration Horn of Africa volume, so it's up online, ready for all to see. Okay, so thanks. So when I started taking a look at this again, I kept asking myself, why does Kissinger care so much about Angola? And the truth is, he really doesn't. Angola is a symbol. The country itself doesn't matter. It's what the country represents that is of crucial importance to him. And you have to look at this in the context of the Cold War and also in an era of détente. Because Kissinger argues that détente is not about making friends with the Soviet Union. It's a way of managing a relationship between adversaries. And his idea was, nothing's really changed. We're just going to do it within this rubric. So in looking at how he goes after the Soviet Union on this, you kind of have to look at the basic principles document itself. And one of the things that it says, the real reason for this extraordinary agreement, was that, quote, it was to avoid military confrontations and to prevent the outbreak of nuclear war. That sounds like a great idea. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed seeing Slim Pickens jump up on that bomb and whip his hat off and ride that bomb into oblivion, but I don't think anybody really wanted to do that in person. So the idea that you could do something that would diminish that possibility was a great idea. However, the problem that started all this remained, which was the Cold War rivalry, and how each of these governments pursued that rivalry in the era of détente is what brings us to this paper. So I would also like to say that these are my ideas, have nothing to do with the Department of State or the U.S. government. And with that, I'll go into why I titled this, Trying Not to Get Clobbered, the U.S. and Angola and the Dismantling of Détente. So after this agreement is reached, everybody has to figure out a way of working within this framework. And for Kissinger, he had a few added challenges in that he had to explain why he was doing this to a skeptical American public, to nervous allies, and he kept telling one and all, nothing has changed, we're just trying to control this relationship. Sort of rein in the Soviets wherever we can. And he emphasized that he wasn't going to give Moscow a pass anywhere and pointed to the various areas in which the United States has stood up to them in the Middle East, in Cuba, and also over access in Berlin. Still, one wonders why, when the situation in Portugal and the overthrow of the Portuguese government in 1974, why Kissinger was very slow to react to that reality. One of the things that I think is important in studying the U.S. policy in Southern Africa, or in Africa as a whole, is that Kissinger knew very little about sub-Saharan Africa and its culture and its people, and didn't seem particularly interested in learning. And so you had a bureaucracy, in particular the Africa Bureau and State Department, telling him something he really did not want to hear. And you see this play out very dramatically in these 40 committee meeting minutes. So a little background on how the United States had dealt with Portuguese Africa and how that changes over time. Except for our involvement in Congo, we had largely kept our distance in sub-Saharan Africa. We had correct relations, but we weren't dramatically involved with anyone. And that was especially true in Portuguese Africa because Portugal was a NATO ally. We didn't want to antagonize them. We definitely needed to maintain our access to bases in the Azores. And so we sort of deferred to them on their relations with their African territories. There were a couple of exceptions where we cut off some military shipments and that sort of thing, and we also provided a little bit of money to Holden Roberto, who was leader of the National Front for the Liberation of Angola, or the FNLA. Mobutu thought he was a great guy, and he was also a relative of Mobutu's, and so we supported him just a little bit. But every administration from Kennedy to Nixon understood that you had to tread lightly in Portuguese Africa, particularly Angola. And a policy paper that was produced in September of 1970 explained why. Angola is a point of friction in our relations with Black African governments and with the Portuguese as well. And the paper went on to note, events in Angola have considerable strategic and political significance for the future of the region. So, in support of U.S. goals there, the department suggested that we really needed to work on balancing South African involvement in the region, which was, of course, going to upset all of the surrounding African countries. And also, no matter what we did, we had to make sure that we minimize the, quote, adverse effects on our use of our base in the Azores. So this is of paramount importance to the department. Now, for the Soviet Union acting in Africa, it was a very different situation. From before independence, Soviet Union was providing all sorts of support for different liberation groups, and that continued well throughout the 60s and into the 70s. And they had, in fact, been supporting communist-leaning governments, or liberation movements in Africa all along. So their support actually ratchets up almost as soon as the Caetano regime in Portugal falls in April of 1974. And all of a sudden, an area where people figured, oh, they'll never gain their independence, they can't defeat the Portuguese, it's not going to happen, all of a sudden, all of these liberation movements are thrown into chaos, because who is going to end up ruling Angola? So they work towards becoming legal political parties, and they form a transition government. And what ends up happening after that is reflected in a Somali proverb that says, either be a mountain or lean on one. And obviously the MPLA, that had always had Moscow support, had their mountain. They didn't need to go after any more. But the FNLA and UNITA needed that support. And in the beginning, the U.S. offered some support, but wasn't overly enthusiastic about getting involved. And in fact, Kissinger didn't think all that much was going to change in Africa as a result of the Portuguese coup. He said, thus far, there is little reaction to events in the metropole from Portuguese territories of Africa. But he did actually understand that it involved more than just the Portuguese territories, because you had the white minority regimes in both South Africa and Rhodesia that were going to get very nervous about all of a sudden there's no more Portuguese defense forces to keep back these liberation movements, and that perhaps they would spread into Rhodesia and South Africa as well. So the first step towards U.S. involvement in the civil war in Angola occurred following Kissinger's August 12th meeting with Zairean officials, in which the foreign minister said, the socialist countries, especially the Soviet Union, have shown a great interest in Angola. They've put forth much propaganda in support of Agostinho Neto, who until now has been the leader of the MPLA, calling him the only true leader of Angolan liberation. Zaire, on the other hand, has supported Holden Roberto, leader of the FNLA. He's a genuine non-communist patriot. So when Kissinger asked, well, what can we do to help you? He says, well, perhaps the United States could assist us in our efforts to counter this pressure. And the best way Kissinger could think of to offer assistance was to offer money. And he goes to Colby and asks Colby to increase the money that is being sent to Holden Roberto. And Colby says, sure, why not? And they increase these payments. So for the rest of 1974, everybody's getting their ducks in a row, getting ready for independence. And then on January 15th, an agreement is signed in which a power-sharing transitional government is put in place, where every liberation movement is involved, and there's also a Portuguese administrator on hand, and they're supposed to draft a constitution and work towards independence. And almost as soon as that document is signed, there's an immediate jockeying for position. All of these groups decide, I'm going to take the military advantage here so that when November 11th rolls around, I'm going to be the top dog. And interestingly, Moscow immediately starts to ramp up support for the MPLA, and Kissinger starts to see, oh, perhaps we should get a little more involved in all of this. But in this new era of détente, both governments decided to tread lightly. And by that I mean neither one was willing to commit troops, but they were both determined to support that effort. And so they found it expedient to work through surrogates in order to do this, which allowed them to fight one of the many proxy wars that they would fight over the years, while claiming that neither government was actually involved. So for Kissinger, America's prestige was in the hands of a group of liberation forces that simply were not up to the task. The Soviets were willing to commit all sorts of personnel, Cuban troops, and more importantly, really good Cuban leadership for those troops that just simply undermined UNITA and FNLA. And Kissinger grows more and more and more frustrated. You can hear it coming out in these 40 committee meeting minutes where he's just basically arguing, you know, we absolutely cannot let the communists win here. And the reason why I titled the paper the way I did was that there was a meeting once things had really gone incredibly downhill, February 3rd meeting, 1976, where Deputy Secretary of Defense Robert Ellsworth says, well, what are we trying to do then? Because at this point, they're running out of money. Congress has cut them off. They're just trying to run down the clock and run out the money. And the newest member of the group, the Director of Central Intelligence, George Bush, quips, well, we're trying not to get clobbered. Unfortunately, that didn't work so well, and Kissinger's efforts to tie Angola to détente also did not work. At the end of it, the Kenyan proverb that I think of when the elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers, truly represents Angola. We ran out of money. Angola is recognized as, the MPLA is recognized as the legitimate government of Angola, and Kissinger has won nothing. Also, nothing has been resolved. The fighting continues. It will continue until 2002. And over that time, over 500,000 people are killed and over 1 million people are internally displaced. And the issue will rise to prominence once again in the Reagan administration as we continue to try to manage these serious problems between the U.S. and the USSR over Africa.
Thank you very much for abbreviating a very richly documented paper. I appreciate that. Let's now turn to Joe.
So I'm going to reiterate, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for the organizers for inviting me back to Austin. It's my first time back since I left over the summer, so it's doubly special, and it's really a great honor to be presenting after Myra, whose volumes clearly I've used, and she's done an excellent job kind of summarizing what went on the diplomatic, the international policy angle, which allows me a little bit more time to talk about this in the context of domestic politics. And what's important, I think, about Angola, and Myra hit on this perfectly, is it's very much a symbol. And it becomes a symbol in domestic politics as well. And the reason why it becomes such an important symbol, I argue, is because this was essentially the first major international Cold War crisis after Vietnam. And so for both individuals on the left and on the right, this was essentially a test case of what is American foreign policy going to be. And I just remembered I have a PowerPoint. What is American policy going to be after Vietnam? Was this an outlier, or is this something that's showing a trend, either one that's replicable in the sense of kind of creating a new internationalist, interventionist Congress that can stop the imperial presidency or the adventurous presidency or the executive? Or is this kind of worrying trend, this decline of American power? And in both cases, on both the left and on the right, or the conservatives and this more kind of progressive internationalism, they're trying to essentially replace the Cold War consensus that's been broken apart by Vietnam with a new consensus. And they're trying to do it around this issue of Angola. And it's actually in failing to do that that we get the politics of the late 1970s and 1980s, essentially the domestic politics of the rest of the Cold War, where you have these two factions vying against each other. And Angola continues to be a symbol of this kind of lack of consensus until you get into the 1980s. And so with that, I'll go ahead and launch into the paper. And as Myra said, Kissinger didn't at first care about this, but he came to see it as important for preserving this larger picture of Détente. If anyone doesn't know, Angola is the large red state on the western side of Africa. And it was the one that was most debated. Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, these weren't as worrisome because they didn't have these competing nationalist parties who used the Cold War to essentially try to advance their individual causes. And so Henry Kissinger was worried that the loss of Angola would essentially be like the loss of China in some ways. It would delegitimize détente. And so what he had to do was make sure that we did not lose Angola because we couldn't fall behind the Soviet Union. Détente was about managing this competition. If the US was seen as falling behind, he could lose the support of allies in Africa, he could lose the support of allies more broadly in Europe, and he could lose domestic support because people were already starting to question détente. And for the policy that Myra described was seen within the White House as relatively staid. We're not sending American troops. We're not sending a lot of money. We're not sending heavy armaments. And so what we're essentially doing in the White House, and Ford believes this too, is we're adopting this very kind of détente-like approach. We're just doing the minimum to retain the status quo. And he thought that no one in the country, including these anti-war activists, could really have a problem with this because we were doing so little. And this was especially true after the Cubans started showing up in Angola, which was seen very much as an escalation. But the problem is Kissinger really did underestimate, I think, how against intervention, how against this kind of Cold War adventurism in the Third World, this internationalist contingent in Congress was. And at the time, Senator Dick Clark had just become the chair of the Africa Subcommittee in the Senate. And he was part of a generation of internationalists that had been elected in the 1970s in the wake of Vietnam. I believe in Dick Clark's case, right before Watergate really broke out, but he was in that 72 class, and their agenda promoted demilitarization, multilateralism, and opposition to foreign adventurism. And they were also starting to flirt with this idea of human rights. And they were particularly concerned that continued support for reactionary governments, like these anti-communist governments that would be held by Holden Roberto if they won out, was really alienating the Third World and really creating a rift between the United States and this kind of group of countries in the global South. And so some of their priorities were very much served by détente, very much served by this lessening of tensions between the US and the Soviet Union. They objected to the kind of amorality that seemed to be adopted by Henry Kissinger in dealing with groups like the Chilean government. And they also objected to this continued prioritization of East-West issues over these other issues of global South, cooperative trade, things like this. And so they saw in Angola this kind of moment, this new Vietnam that they had to rally against before we got to the point where we were committing troops, before we got to the point where we were committing more power. And so much of what was happening in the fall was this relatively small group of internationalists, and actually started to lose power by 1975. This group of internationalists led by Clark, led by Senator Culver, also from Iowa. Ted Kennedy was involved with this, John Tunney in California, trying to convince the rest of the Senate essentially to cut off aid to Angola without congressional approval. And they were helped in this matter by two things. One, South Africa intervened, which was very unpopular, this apartheid government. As soon as South Africa intervened, and it was publicly known in 1975, a huge portion of the American populace didn't want to get involved. And the other thing that they were helped out by was the fact that Ford essentially continued to lie about what kind of aid the U.S. was giving. And there's this wonderful kind of Keystone Cops moment where there are two officials who come in to testify to Congress, and one of them shows up late and says, no, of course we're not giving aid, and not realizing someone had just come in before and said, yes, we are giving aid, right? So this idea that Ford was lying to the Congress kind of motivated these individuals to line up and essentially vote not only to support Clark's amendment, which said, the Congress has to approve any additional funds that are going to Angola, but the Tunney amendment that was added in right before Christmas that said not only are we going to end aid to Angola, but we're going to take away $33 million from the defense budget that we believe was already spent in there. And this was kind of a slap in the face of the administration. And partially it's this sacred cow. You don't add riders like this onto the defense budget, but we're going to do it, and we're going to get a push passed. And for these individuals, these internationalists, Angola was really this symbol of the power of the Congress, the power of this new critical internationalism in the wake of Vietnam. And so this, I think, is extremely important for understanding this new, more assertive kind of leftism, this anti-Cold Warism. And Angola proves that, this is possible. It doesn't take American troops being sent overseas to kind of organize against this. We can use the Congress, we can use the committee system to really constrain an adventurous executive. But at the same time that this is going on, as this debate is happening in Congress and these internationalists are winning, there's a group of conservatives who are looking at this from a very different perspective, and they're applying a very different lesson of Vietnam to this. And they're essentially saying that, these conservatives, Angola represents something more concerning than just strategic miscalculations or maybe putting our forces into the wrong country. The presence of Soviet arms, and especially Cuban troops, which are very much seen as proxies for the Soviet Union during this period, is a natural policy of the outgrowth of Détente, right? The Soviet Union is being emboldened to be more adventurous because we have this weak policy that's not seeking to challenge the Soviet Union. And so there were a number of individuals like William F. Buckley, but also Norman Podhoretz, who've been very critical of the fact that the Soviets are building up a nuclear arsenal. They'd consolidated power in Eastern Europe. And now this was kind of a new, more adventurous Soviet Union that's actually reaching out and sending troops across the Atlantic Ocean, picking them up in Cuba, taking them to Angola. And historian Theodore Draper calls this the, quote, imperial expansionist phase of the Soviet Union's foreign policy. And they're saying that this is essentially empowered by Détente. The Soviet Union believes it can get away with this because the United States is unwilling to challenge them. And so this probably would have been just more hand-wringing like there had been for the past year since Vietnam or South Vietnam had fallen. But the intersection of Angola with the election year of 1976 essentially allowed this kind of rabid anti-communist wing of the Republican Party to mount an insurrection. And Ronald Reagan became the standard bearer for this kind of new conservative movement. And for Ronald Reagan, when he launched his campaign officially in January, he identified a weak foreign policy as one of the reasons why he was a better leader than Ford, and he specifically focused on the idea of Angola. And not only was Angola worrying as this kind of, this trend line, the second point to have a trend line of Vietnam and that we're a declining power, but it was an opportunity to stand up and, as he said, essentially eye down the Soviet Union to finally prevent them from moving further with this. And Reagan's tough rhetoric really touched a chord with the American populace that was also concerned about Soviet power during this period. And so one of the reasons why he did so well in these early primaries in beginning in March of 1976 was because he was speaking about a new, more powerful, more confrontational American foreign policy that a lot of people thought was necessary. And so he began making very surprising gains, actually won just under 12 states, a dozen states, I think it was 11 states officially, in this early primary season, actually defeating, the incumbent Ford. And Ford's unwillingness to override the Congress when it essentially said, you can't use any more money there, was a crisis of leadership. It was called a creeping policy paralysis by one of the kind of conservatives who was pushing for a more moral foreign policy. And the idea was, there was this fear that Détente had actually defanged the Soviet Union. The American populace didn't understand what this threat was. And what was needed was somebody who could communicate to the people, who could kind of rally the people against this Vietnam syndrome that seemed to have taken over. And Reagan was very much kind of held up by this conservative punditry class as the person who's able to do this. Ford, as Mr. Reed said this afternoon, right, he didn't have that common touch. He couldn't really communicate with the people, but Reagan could. And so he was going to be the way that we advance this new policy. And this was seen as extremely important, not just because of the symbolism of Angola as this power for the new Soviet Union, but because this fear of American allies losing faith in the country and its ability to lead seemed to be coming true. And this wasn't just in Africa. This was actually going on in Europe. There are a number of European countries that said, we're worried about what the United States can do. Specifically, how can it deal with Congress? This seems like a constitutional crisis where the executive is actually losing power. And Margaret Thatcher, actually in 1976, gets the name Iron Lady because of a speech she gives on Angola against Détente. And it's seen as such an attack on the Soviet Union that the Soviet Union responds, well, there's this Iron Lady going around and essentially criticizing us. And so this shows you in many ways how important Angola was in 1976 to really a kind of transnational group of people who were pushing for a more active Cold War. And we've kind of forgotten that, right? No one can tell you where Iron Lady came from. You wouldn't know that Angola was mentioned 4 or 5 times in the speech, but it very much was. And so this was the problem facing conservatives in the United States. And what happened was with Angola, it started to change the way that a number of groups, not just conservatives, but also these kind of centrist anti-communists saw the Cold War. And Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld actually saw that this was happening. And he said, and I'll quote here, after Angola, you'll see the mood in this country shift. You'll see people become concerned about defense. And this is what he said after the vote happened. And this is essentially exactly what started happening in February and March after this vote took place in January. All of a sudden, even some of the people who had voted for the Clark and Tunney amendments started thinking, well, maybe we went too far. Maybe we've gone too far down this path of the Vietnam syndrome. And now we actually are starting to looking weak. Now that Margaret Thatcher is questioning us, now that the Korean foreign minister is actually questioning us, maybe what we need to do is focus a little bit more on defense, because it shouldn't just be about Vietnam and how we're afraid to engage with the world anymore. And so in March, after 5 years of budget slashing, the House Armed Services Committee actually reversed course and recommended that spending be raised above White House requests on defense, which was seen as a huge victory. And at the time, the press actually said, this is because of Angola. This is because of the threat of Angola and people recognizing this. And a key component in this new conservatism that was coming around in 1976 was these centrist Democrats, or these centrist former Democrats like Podhoretz, who became very concerned. And when the Committee on the Present Danger released their kind of broadside in late 1976, they never mentioned Angola specifically, but they were talking about Soviet adventurism. They repeatedly referenced Africa, and they referenced this idea of what we need is to remind the public of the dangers of the Soviet Union, of their willingness to kind of project their power abroad and rally people against this and create, quote, a new consensus, right? And so this was a search for this kind of new anti-communist consensus in the wake of Vietnam. And so just as a conclusion, Angola continued to play this very important role after 1976. Reagan, in these kind of, if you want to call them wilderness years, when he's writing very much, kind of preparing himself for 1980, repeatedly refers to Angola and repeatedly refers to Cuba specifically and what Cuba's doing in Angola. And it's this reason that in 1981, when he's finally elected, one of the first foreign policy things he tries to do is push through support for Jonas Savimbi in Angola, because it's become almost the shibboleth for the conservative movement trying to advance a new anti-communism. And so just to conclude in my last 40 seconds, Angola represented, I think, a pivot point in the history of U.S. foreign affairs. As politicians and the population struggled to define a coherent response to Soviet involvement in the Third World after Vietnam, 2 coalitions essentially emerged. The internationalists in Congress and within the community of activists that were still very much involved at this point. But at the same time, this victory for these activists, for these congressional internationalists in Angola, actually served to kind of steel the resolve of a conservative movement that was just starting to come together in a kind of new neoconservatism. And so I think this is very important in the fact that both of them essentially rejected Détente. They both saw it as amoral for different reasons. And in so doing, they started the process of dismantling Détente and replacing it with something else. But because there was no consensus, we get this constant debate that dogs dogs domestic politics of the Cold War until the fall of the Berlin Wall. All right, thank you so much.
Joe, thank you very much. And finally, we have David.
Good afternoon. I'm going to be talking for my 15 minutes about another source of documentation that you can use as a complement to foreign relations of the U.S. and any other manuscript collections that you may find at presidential libraries or elsewhere. I'm referring to the President's Daily Briefs. Just earlier this year, we declassified over 28,000 pages of President's Daily Briefs from the Nixon and Ford administrations. sorry to say, too late for inclusion in any FRUS volumes, but you can do some backward work to complement the sources. This sounds like a huge innovation in research, that we now have the top-level analysis, the president speaking directly to the CIA and back about various issues at the highest levels. This is the premier agency analytic product. That's all to the good, but we want to put it into a context of the relationship between the president and the CIA, because the documents themselves don't speak for themselves. You have to put them into the process of interaction and engagement between CIA and the White House during those two very different administrations, in which with Richard Nixon, you have a hostile audience, and with Gerald Ford, you have a very eager consumer of those products. So stepping back a bit, I want to spend a few minutes describing the very different interactions and relationships between the agency and CIA and the way in which the president's daily brief factored into the intelligence process. Let's start with a vignette about a transition. This is December 1968, January 1969. The agency is routinely sending up analytic products to, this is starting to sound a little familiar, a transition headquarters at a hotel in New York City. In this case, it's the Pierre Hotel, and the agency had set up an advanced base. We called it DDI New York at the time. This is the entrepot for the material being cabled up and shipped up from headquarters. Amongst all of this analytic product are all of the president's daily briefs. Now, in addition to the document that was going to Lyndon Johnson at the time, we also got directives from Henry Kissinger that we needed to create something special for President Nixon. Because of his long-standing hostility to the agency and suspicions about us, we needed to kind of sell ourselves. So for the first time in our history, we were creating a second PDB called the Nixon Special that went up to him in envelopes. And when we closed down our base of operations at the Pierre Hotel, all of those envelopes are returned to our officer unopened. So we have an immediate insight into the fact that what we have here is a failure to communicate. And how are we going to bridge this? Well, Henry Kissinger was very helpful about this, and he provides us with some pointers early on about what we need to do with the PDB. He wanted it to be more strategic. He thought it had too many articles of relatively little consequence, things that he, as he disparagingly put it, are hardly worth the attention of an Assistant Secretary of State, let alone the President. So he suggests that we do certain things not only with the content, but also with the format. And if you go to the CIA website where you can start printing out, as I have here, a number of these documents, you'll notice that they are in legal size. Why do you think that is? Because of Nixon's proclivity for scribbling on legal pads. So we thought, as a sort of an act of salesmanship, if we make it look and feel like a legal pad, maybe he'll pick it up and read it. Truth be told, that didn't pan out because Henry Kissinger controlled the intelligence flow through the White House. And this is a fundamental fact to keep in mind. There's nothing in any law or executive order that mandates that the president have a certain kind of relationship with the CIA or with the National Security Council, for that matter. So the question of whether we are there briefing the president, whether he's reading our product, whether the National Security Advisor is really the National Intelligence Advisor de facto, that's strictly up to the president. And in this case, we certainly have Henry Kissinger as the National Intelligence Advisor. The DCIs throughout this period of time do not play an important role in the day-to-day process. In fact, Bill Colby probably had 3 or 4 meetings only with Nixon during the whole time he was director. So the key here is that the PDB may be going to the White House in a form that we thought the president would like to see, and we even played around with the appearance of it by changing the boldface, the italics, putting analysis separate from facts. We heard from John Mitchell, for example, that the president is a lawyer. He wants facts first, then the analysis. Don't mix it all up like we used to do in previous iterations. So we're trying to custom tailor the product for him. But the point is, it's going to Henry Kissinger, and it's being left there essentially with the national security staff to be put into a Cuisinart, and out of which comes every morning a national security briefing memo, ones of which you have undoubtedly seen in the presidential libraries. What you'll notice here is that the PDB itself, or according to CIA, is never mentioned in those memos. The PDB as a standalone product is effectively lost because amidst the big pile of stuff that Nixon gets every day through Kissinger, the top piece of paper is always this briefing memo. And so somewhere in the pile you might find the PDB, but Nixon isn't necessarily reading it. In fact, we know he probably never got around to reading it. So what this means then is that if you get a hold of a pile of PDBs for the Kissinger-Nixon period, you have to understand how they were used and how they were factored in. So the key point there is to complement the PDB itself with these other documents that you know the president was seeing via Henry Kissinger, like the morning briefing memo, and perhaps other materials that you find in the FRUS documents. We tried very hard during the first Nixon term to improve the relationship, and we got some interesting cues from Andrew Marshall, and they're very well documented in some of the FRUS volumes about the organization of national security policy. Andy Marshall was a kind of an advocate for ours, and he was quite critical of the way in which Kissinger and Nixon ran their process. For example, there's no feedback mechanism here. And Marshall says flatly to Kissinger, "You're in the president's working style doesn't lend itself to feedback. You like to just go sit in the office, shut the door, cook something up, and you don't listen to anybody. You don't tell them how you got the information to make those decisions and so forth." So we try to work through Marshall a little bit, but it doesn't particularly accomplish much. Shifting to Ford, here you have a night and day comparison, where all the hostility and the resentment and the suspicions are replaced by a sense of trust, a sense of openness, and a sense of wanting to work with us. Ford is the first president to get a daily briefing. He starts getting it while he's vice president, and he really likes the PDB. He doesn't mandate any particular changes in the appearance very much, though if you go to the Ford PDBs, you'll notice some kind of tinkering in the look and feel over time, but it's effectively the same kind of legal-sized document. The key, however, is that you have a CIA officer, not the director, but a senior analyst from what was then the Office of Current Intelligence, going down every morning with the document at the president's request. When he wanted this process continued after he became president, Kissinger didn't like the idea. Ford told him, "Remember who you work for," and the process continued. So Dave Peterson, the name of the analyst, goes down every morning with the document, sits there with the president face to face with Kissinger or Scowcroft later, and briefs from that, and gets immediate feedback, which he then takes to the Situation Room and informs them what the president and the National Security Advisor are interested in for that day. He also phones back directly to CIA to gin up the current intelligence apparatus. So it's during the Ford administration that you find this kind of daily frenzy of feeding the PDB, informing the president, what was he interested in, and what so forth. That kind of mania that many of my colleagues at the agency deal with 24/7, that starts to gain momentum during the Ford administration. Now, I'd like to talk for the remaining time about three particular crises on the periphery as they appear in the PDB, and these are the ways in which you can use these documents as supplements to other kinds of material. I'll start with Chile, which has been alluded to here and there, but I'd like to focus on what the president was hearing about emerging events in 1973. We're not going to revisit the 1970 period or the 70 to 73 period. I want to look at the several months run-up before the coup on, as the Chilean activist lobby says, the other 9/11, 9/11, 1973. What did the president know via the PDB, and did it seem to have much factor in any of his decision-making? And more so, the kind of persistent question, did we know that the coup was coming? Were we behind the coup? We certainly were not. Did we have indicators in the months and weeks before the coup that something was brewing? Yes, we certainly did. Did we provide what we would call in the intelligence business strategic warning that something amiss was probably going to happen? Yes, we did. We investigated the implications of it in annexes to the PDB. It appears in FRUS documents and certain national intelligence estimates and memos to the White House and such. So it's very clear, I think, from the record that we were clearly informing the White House over the months preceding the coup that Allende was in deep trouble, that the military was very hostile. We did give some analysis of the 6/30/73 rump Air Force coup that never went anywhere. We did not have warning for that. And another thing you can do when you're using the PDB is kind of try to parse the sources and methods that don't appear on the paper. We routinely redact explicit references to sources and methods in these articles, but sometimes an article will come through 100% clean, and then you can try to kind of figure out what we were getting our intelligence from. Was it SIGINT? Was it HUMINT? Was it other kinds of sources? And we had a reasonably good ear to the ground about what was going on there during that period of time. So I printed out a fairly thick stack of these dating from roughly 6/30, the time right after that Air Force coup. And you can see if you leaf through them, increasing reporting almost daily. Chile became a very prominent issue by August of '73, in which our reporting is dealing with political dynamics, mounting tensions within the military. We have a pretty good feel about how a coup, if it occurred, would come off, that it would require across-the-board multi-service effort, and the Carbonari had to be involved with it too. So it had to be a full kind of security apparat push. It just couldn't be one branch of the service staking out a flag on the presidential palace and then having it as a rally point for the rest of the dissidents. We do see a sort of a spike in disarray and discontent among key sectors of Chilean society and politics throughout August, but we're starting to find a sort of a rundown of the intensity of it by late August, to the point at which by the time the coup is about to occur, we are relatively flat-footed. After a lull in several days, anti-government protests are rising again, we say on the 7th, but then on the 10th, the situation remains tense as Allende continues to search for a way to return to the political offensive. And then, I regret to say, the 9/11 PDB on Chile is totally redacted, mainly for sources and methods reasons, and I can understand why. But truth be told, this coup was rather a surprise to the United States intelligence community. And though we follow it very, very rigorously in the ensuing days with very long articles in the PDB, we're mainly focusing there principally on who's coming out on top, how are they dealing with the economy, and other kinds of issues. I think in sum you can say that the PDB documentation provides a pretty good window into what the agency knew about Chile, a fairly accurate one and well worth doing research in. Turning quickly to the Yom Kippur War, I would flag a couple of items here for you. Back in 2011, the agency declassified its history of the William Colby directorship, and it's available out on the public website also. There's a very good chapter on the Yom Kippur War in which it lays out, based on internal agency documentation, all of the fairly fundamental analytic, collection, and perceptual flaws that gripped the intelligence community throughout, which led it to be a massive community-wide intelligence failure. In effect, nobody saw it coming for a whole variety of reasons. It's quite accurately told in there. We also see it in the PDB. The agency was watching the growing tensions, the Sadat saber rattling, the military exercises, but we're gradually tapering it off throughout the summer, to the point at which we're kind of lulled into a spirit of complacency, exactly what Sadat wanted. And here we have on 10/5/73, the night before, the military exercises underway in Egypt seem to be on a larger scale than before, but they do not appear to be preparations for an offensive against Israel. And then on 10/6, the basic PDB article is, neither side seems bent on starting hostilities, but thankfully we had the ability to throw in a late item. Planning a coordinated attack across the Suez Canal. Caught very much flat-footed on that one, and the documentation going to the president is very clear. Last real quick thing, just because the name came up earlier, the Kurds, the Kurdish uprising. One of the most cynical covert actions ever undertaken, and the basic lesson here is don't do covert action at the behest of an ally. you do it for yourself, not because the Shah of Iran wants to do it. Henry Kissinger famously said, covert action is not missionary work, and the evidence of that is pretty clear in this. We tried to maintain a pretty good face on the incidents as they were going down throughout 73, 74, and 75, but again, worth looking at as a supplement to the other documentation from FRUS and from the presidential papers. Thanks.
Thank you, David. I know we're supposed to break at 3. I'm assuming that we will maybe go over that a little bit because we a little titch. Okay, I like 3:15. That's good. I will just as the panel did. I will ensure that I am very, very brief in my comments. I don't have comments specific to the papers, but much like my predecessors as chair, I just want to draw a few common themes that I got from all 3 of these papers, and rather all 4 of these papers. And I think first and foremost is our panel is entitled "The Crises on the Periphery," and I think that these papers prove that the periphery was not peripheral. This is to call it a periphery. I mean, if I were living in one of these countries, I would find that deeply insulting. But even beyond the insulting aspect, these papers prove that the U.S.-Soviet competition outside of Europe was not a peripheral aspect of the Cold War, but rather a key component, both abroad and at home, actually, both in terms of our foreign policy approach and domestic politics. So that leads me to think, well, if the periphery is not peripheral, what does that say about how we should understand détente? I mean, this is a question that Jeremy put, what is détente? Clearly, détente does bring stability in some areas of the world, but not all. And I think that these papers show quite clearly that, of course, as Myra points out, détente was never meant to be an end to the Cold War. Détente was a way to manage the Cold War in an era of relative American decline. And it was based upon the notion that there could be cooperation, but competition would not cease. So it was the coexistence of cooperation and competition. And as I was thinking about this, I realized that détente is, in a sense, an attempt to have it both ways, actually. And the very fact that with détente, the United States is engaging simultaneously in cooperation and competition with the Soviet Union actually leaves it open to attacks by both sides of the political aisle, as Joe showed us in his paper. It also make me think, was détente ever meant to be a comprehensive approach to managing the Cold War? And should we expect it to have been? Or should we really be surprised that ultimately it foundered on so many different issues? It also brings up the issue of continuity in U.S. policy. I think we think of Nixon going to China, we think of Nixon going to the Soviet Union, and we think, wow, this really represents a real break in the United States' approach to the world. But really, again, given détente's bifurcated nature, in some ways it's not. In some ways it does indicate a break in foreign policy, but the continuance of proxy wars, the continuance throughout the quote-unquote periphery, really suggests that, no, this is just a continuation of a Cold War fought by other means, I guess. And finally, I want to say that I think all 4 papers did a nice job of picking up on a theme that Sarah brought up earlier, talking about how when we think about the Nixon Ford administrations, different policymakers matter. Like we're so focused on Henry Kissinger and Nixon and Ford, and they're bigger than life persons. I remember when I started the Office of the Historian, and I worked on Nixon Ford volumes, and our then general editor Ted Kiefer warned me and everybody else, don't be mesmerized by Henry Kissinger. He can really get you in his grip, and you can forget the rest of the policymakers. But I think that these 4 papers prove today that there are a lot of other inputs into the policymaking process, whether it's Congress, which came up repeatedly, whether it's the changing nature with the intelligence community, individual advisors, Elliot Richardson, Steve highlights in his paper, come to mind. And I think the importance of understanding the policymaking process, just so we can, not only so we can understand it, but also because it sort of raises the question of, well, who owns détente? Like whose policy is this really? And to what extent does it succeed and or fail because of other players, both within the executive branch as well as congressional branches and other countries, and also NGOs have something to say about it as well. with that, I'll turn it over to questions. Yep, please, please.
Sure, that's dangerous. I'm Cindy, I'm a pre-doc at the Clements Center. This question more has to do with Angola. As is often the case for post-colonies, the threat of Soviet influence can get in the way of agency within that post-colony itself. And the fear of revolution and an uprising at the massive level in Angola was, of course, in part seen in the lens of the Cold War, but is that really the only framework in which we should be thinking about it? And for the histories that you write and the work that you've done for these papers, is that the primary way to think of it, that Soviet influence is the primary instigator of potential mass uprising?
I would say no, definitely not. I think that one of the problems that Kissinger had was he didn't listen when people like Kenneth Kaunda were telling him, we don't want the Soviets in here. We turned to them because we came to you and you wouldn't help. So it was less a question of trying to embrace the Soviet Union than just gaining independence from the colonial powers or gaining assistance against aggressions from their neighbors and that sort of thing. In terms of the internal uprising, it was just the destabilizing nature of colonialism and how they would go into a nation and pick individuals to work with and leave everybody else sort of behind. And that's so it's just a normal jockeying for control once that power comes out. But I think the reason why Angola blew up so quickly was because the Soviets just kept pouring money and material into the country to ensure that the MPLA would win. And that truly destabilized. And then we had to match them, and it just snowballed from there.
And I think it's worth adding that the parties themselves didn't necessarily, identify the international sphere as a kind of East-West Cold War type of issue. I mean, one of the reasons why Mozambique didn't see an American, an anti-Frelimo intervention until Reagan came in, was that there was this sense that, Frelimo had actually appealed not just to they actually appealed more to China than the Soviet Union, but not just to these kind of communist powers, but also to the US and to Europe. And Frelimo and the PAIGC in Guinea-Bissau, and also to a lesser extent the MPLA, which was always kind of this, third cousin that didn't have quite as much money and didn't have quite as much diplomacy going on. They all had relationships with Western powers. And one of the things that you see is the British Labour government was very against getting involved in Angola because some of the leaders of the party knew folks from the MPLA and they had no problem with them and they didn't see them as communist ideologues or anything. So there wasn't this fear of this the same way that Margaret Thatcher and some other folks had. And I think even in the United States, most people, especially in the internationalists, were trying to look at this from a North-South issue, not East-West, right? How can we deal with, the natural rebellion that's going to come from colonialism, which by 1976 everyone agrees is outdated, but the Portuguese just refused to kind of go along with the plan. So it's very much more complicated than simply East-West. It's North-South. It's a new internationalism. It's a new leftism. It's all these kind of things mixing together.
This is not so much a substantive question as a process one, spurred by the fact that I think 4 of the 5 people on at this table are government employees. Is there reason to expect that the imminent change of political management of the executive branch would bring about a different attitude with respect to openness of government declassification and the airing of important information about our past?
As a mid-level manager, unfortunately, I can't answer that question. But, so maybe I'll throw it over to the office director.
Actually, as an office director, I can't either. No, our job is to do our work, and we will continue to do our work. then adjust to circumstances.
I think that what we probably can say is that over the 150 plus years of the Foreign Relations series has been in print, there has been our office has faced challenges time and again to meeting the mandate of being, the 1991 mandate of being thorough, open, and reliable, thorough, accurate, and reliable rather, and we're all professionally trained historians, and we see this as our mission is to making sure that we continue to uphold this tradition. So, Todd?
I'll just add that the agency declassification programs of which the PDB is a part operate under certain mandatory requirements, and especially under the new modified FOIA law, we will be required, assuming requests come in, to release more information, particularly in the draft document category. Certainly we'll continue to work as we have been with FRUS, responding to MDRs, things of that sort. We do have a discretionary declassification program that enables us to target particular sets of records and organize releases around them. You've probably seen some of our collections and such. If not, they're out on our website. We hope to be able to continue with that kind of procedure, partnering with institutions and having conferences and things of that sort. Resources are always a constraint, but I wouldn't anticipate a pullback from that.
Todd?
And I'm Todd Bennett from East Carolina University, formerly, however, a State Department employee. So just to add to what's been said, the Foreign Relations series has been published since 1861, is that correct? And it has flourished, it's nonpartisan publication, and has flourished under both Democratic and Republican administrations. And no doubt that will continue into the future. But one question I had for Dr. Robarge is, you spoke about the, I think to use your word, hostile relationship between the agency and Richard Nixon, Helms and Richard Nixon. I wonder if you could maybe speak to that relationship a little bit, please.
I pity poor Richard Helms because I can't imagine working under two successive bosses named Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon as Director of Central Intelligence. He once said, "You only work for one president at a time," which I think is an important insight as we go through a new transition. We can anticipate some leadership changes. We already had an announcement this morning about a new director designate, member of the House Oversight Committee. Helms's strength, I think, was his political savvy. He was a very adept, very perceptive political actor. He knew how far to go, what to do to maintain access, where to draw the line. Some people argue with where he drew the line in a couple of instances. But his overriding concern was that if the agency doesn't retain access to the White House, it's irrelevant. And it doesn't matter what you do with the PDB if the president isn't reading it because he doesn't think you're important and have anything important to say to inform decision-making, you're out of the picture. So if you look back at his experience, he started in with Johnson in '66 and had a cordial business-like relationship, but Johnson was still a sort of a hard-to-please customer. It wasn't until the '67 war when the agency hits the nail on the head 3 straight times about who's going to win, will the Russians stay out, and so forth. That sells the agency to him, and he has access from that point on. Eventually, with Nixon, you have the persistent effort to overcome that animosity, both personally and culturally and politically. Nixon always thought the agency was staffed with Détente from Ivy League schools and the Georgetown set. At one point, and this is, I think, is in one of the FRUS volumes, issues a directive to Bob Haldeman to fire them all, hire more people with police and military backgrounds, stop recruiting from the coastal schools, things like that. It bespeaks this intense distrust. The other issue, though, which doesn't come up that often, is Nixon, acting upon the Schlesinger report, wanted Richard Helms to engage much more heavily in running the community. And Helms did not want to do that. He was much more comfortable running the agency and leaving community affairs to subordinates. And so he tries to slow roll the president on this one. And eventually the clock ran out on Nixon and it becomes a moot issue. Of course, Helms is dismissed earlier than that. Some people claim it's categorically because Helms wouldn't play with the Watergate cover-up. Other people have contended that an additional factor is that Nixon was fundamentally dissatisfied with Helms's management of the community and wanted a replacement. Now, why he picked Bill Colby to do that is another question. One can argue what was the point of bringing in an insider from an operational background, a career intelligence officer, to run the community. That's a pretty insular sort of background. There are other reasons why he picked Colby to do that.
I think we have time for one more question.
I just wondered if there were any things in these.
Could you say
I'm sorry, James Withrow. I was just wondering if there were anything, any kind of recurring themes that came up in these papers that you looked at. Any comments that you might want to have with 2020 hindsight about the papers and their judgment of Soviet aims and capabilities.
I think it's open for all four, actually. Maybe perhaps even the assessment. Maybe let's reframe and say this, the assessment of Soviet capabilities. How much of a threat was the Soviet Union seen to be? Is that?
I guess I'll try that out. So one thing I would say as well, especially when working with this kind of conservative reaction, I think some of the fear of the potential for the Soviet Union to really project its power was overstated. There does seem to be a truth to the fact that Détente did give the Soviet a certain assumption that they might be able to get away with something they hadn't done before. And so did Vietnam, for that matter. So Angola, despite the fact I think I agree with Pierre Iglesias' idea that to some extent this was actually Cuba that was pushing some of the more extreme elements and the Soviet Union was going along. One of the reasons it went along was because it felt that the United States wouldn't respond like it did in Vietnam. That Vietnam had essentially cowed the power. And so this was an opportunity for the Soviet Union to maybe push the envelope a little bit. Now, I mean, I think that there was a real overstatement of what this meant for American security, and I think you can see that happening in Afghanistan. I mean, that essentially became the Soviet Vietnam, and I think that was going to happen sooner or later, that they were going to overreach and put a little bit too much, and they were going to have the same kind of political backlash that happened in the U.S. But there really was a perception, as far as I can tell in the Kremlin, that Détente allowed them to do things that they couldn't do earlier.
Steve, David, Myra, anything you want to add?
With reference to the time period, I was talking about the Soviet center into the Vietnam triangle or quadrilateral or whatever relationship as another of Nixon's attempt to secure the ceasefire by having them shut down the equipment flow to North Vietnam, which, as far as I can tell, was effective only in the area of actually offensive artillery weapons. For the most part, they sustained their flow of materiel, and basically they were there in a triangular relationship with China, trying to secure their relationship with the North Vietnamese. So, and that seemed to be pretty well understood. I mean, by the reports that I've seen.
If I could add on, I actually think it's fair to say that in some ways Angola was also a competition with China as well, because China had backed Savimbi at various points over the previous time. So the Soviets were getting in there in some ways to balance off what they thought might be China and the U.S. trying to team up and push a specific government.
Yeah, I think over the course of the Vietnam War that Nixon and Kissinger came in with a pretty exaggerated understanding of Soviet influence on the North Vietnamese, which waned over time, and they became more kind of understanding of the determined autonomy as far as they could preserve it of the North Vietnamese.
they were truly trying to be more non-aligned, and the reason why the Cubans stayed was because Savimbi was still a threat and South Africa was still a threat, but it wasn't so much that they wanted a Soviet influence in Angola.
I'll just add that in the three issues that I looked at, the Chile coup, the Yom Kippur War, and the Kurdish uprising, it's very clear from the PDBs and the collateral intelligence that the agency was producing that the Soviet threat underlays much of the concern with those various issues. Now, what you won't find in the analytic products are excursions into broader strategic policy analysis, if you will. That's not the reason why the PDB is written. It's supposed to be quite topical and quite focused. But you can certainly see, I'd say more so with Chile as a peripheral crisis, a lot of concern about the potential for another Cuba being established down there. And that motivates much of the attention that the administration is giving to it at that time.
And with that, please join me in thanking once again our four panelists.